So you just finished watching Outlaw King, and you want to find something to talk to with it about. But let's be honest here, not everybody likes historical epics the same way you do. So if you haven't seen the film yet, make sure to stop right now and watch it before continuing, because this will be pretty spoiler heavy. But this is our first impressions for the film.
Sure.
And before we go any further, 30 seconds of who we are. I'm Cody Bonds. I run a YouTube channel for history, obviously, but I have a master's degree in archaeology for screen media, and I actually specialized on my dissertation in taking medieval combat and then translating it to film, so you can understand why I'd be pretty excited about this. And to my left is Dr. Rachel Lynn, librarian and dramaturg.
So I help writers write better scripts. I have a background in dramaturgy, so I help mostly playwrights, but I've also helped some writers of screenplays better develop the flow of their work as sort of an informed outsider.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I actually think the film itself, I really enjoyed it. But the problems it had nothing to do with history or historical adaptation.
No, I felt like they hit a lot of really good notes, story-wise. That it had a lot of good bones to it. And I understand that it's not getting great reviews, and I don't think that that's entirely fair. I think that what might be happening is that people have a lot of nostalgia and love for other historical epics, specifically Braveheart. And when they see it, they're saying, it's not Braveheart. Why didn't they just make Braveheart 2? And that can be really hard emotionally for people who are very attached to this time period to get over. Because I think for a lot of people who love this time period, that was an introduction for them.
It was actually the movie that started me on a career studying history. I'll readily admit that. Yeah, it's trending currently at a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is way too low for a film of this caliber. Now, I'm not saying the film's perfect, but as far as history goes, I mean, it's pretty much on point. I mean, you can check on my channel for the basically a story of Robert the Bruce that covers this period, and you'll notice it is almost perfectly paint by numbers from beginning to end. Even some of the details in it just astounded me. Like, I honestly had no clue that Robert the Bruce's father had gone on crusade with Edward Longshanks. I mean, that was new information to me, and that's how deep and detailed they're getting here. Or that the Bruce's wife was the king's goddaughter. I mean, still, that's getting pretty damn nitty gritty at that point. But yeah, but there is one kind of elephant in the room when it comes to the film, though, when it comes to historical inaccuracy. I mean, you actually turned to me as we were watching the film and even asked.
I thought this could not be real history. And not only that, but it kind of breaks the film. This moment breaks the film for me. So this is a major spoiler. At the end, Edward II comes in and he gets left by his army as the army is retreating. And he's the only man standing. And then the Scottish army just lets him go.
Well, not only that, they're like ignoring the fight between two kings. Like, it's just not happening.
Right.
And then
they tried to cover it. I actually noticed that they were doing a lot of covering. So they made the Scottish army chase back the English army. So there was an element of distraction to try to justify this rather bizarre fight between two kings. So what they're doing is they're trying to bookend the film. So it starts with this fight. With a very different power structure, very different power dynamic. And they wanted to end with it as well. Yeah. And they just sort of fell in love with the idea so much that when it breaks a lot of the world, they were like, it'll be fine, nobody will notice, it'll be fine. And we were watching it with someone else as well, and we all were like, is this happening right now? So we're completely removed from the film. We're no longer invested in the film at this very pivotal moment. We're all questioning Robert the Bruce's sanity. He must have.
The king walk free. Because, I mean, at this point in the film, his wife and daughter are both taken captive. His country is still majorly occupied. And he's letting his major bargaining piece just walk away.
Right.
That just seems like lunacy.
It does, and especially since they just spent the past hour developing Robert de Bruce's character as being shrewd and sly, and quite good at being a king, and justifying his decision to become a king. And then they undermine it by taking away all of his political savvy for no real reason at all.
And I think it's actually compounded by the very next scene, in which his wife is just mysteriously returned to him. It's like, it even goes on to say that, you know, she was transferred as a prisoner transfer, which you're wondering, that's actually from a much later battle called the Battle of Bannockburn. In the history of Robert the Bruce, Loudon Hill is sort of the starting point, but a very minor one. Everyone remembers him for a completely different battle, which isn't even featured in the film. But she's returned after that battle in a prisoner exchange. I mean, all they had to do was just have him captured and then exchange him for her right there. If you're already going to break history, well, then at least make it consistent.
Right.
And she's kind of comes back out of left field for some reason.
I personally would have changed the fight entirely so that the power dynamic isn't that off.
Yeah.
And just have him run away with the army. I just don't think it's necessary at all.
But the fights, really good. I mean, it's funny because the high watermark now for medieval battles is ironically a fantasy film, which is Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones. I mean, it's hard to describe just how much that sort of changed the game on how people look at fights. And I think from at least a visual standpoint, I mean, I appreciate that in this film you can tell what's going on. There's actually strategy going on. You can tell them going to the flanks. You have a rough idea where positions are. I think there was a really big issue back in especially the 90s and 2000s where shaky cam was really common. And it was just more about the chaos of a fight versus the strategy.
And in this one, that's incredibly important. If you don't understand the strategy, nothing that's happening makes any sense because you can't get over the 3,000 cavalry versus the 500 standing men unless you understand that there's strategy in place.
But you brought up a good point as well about body count as well.
It seemed like there were way too many bodies just scattered all over the field, so this sense of channeling doesn't visually read because there's bodies everywhere.
And I mean, most battles typically fell apart around 75% casualties for either side. I mean, with very few exceptions do they ever fight to last man standing. And in that case, I mean, it seems like both armies had, what, like 100, 200 guys left? I mean, it was just going on forever and ever and ever.
It was lengthy.
Yeah, it really was. And it's funny because when I get to that final battle in that film, I wasn't as invested as I thought it was going to be. And I've been trying to figure out why. And there's I mean, when it comes to filmmaking and storytelling, there's a concept called the darkest night, which is whenever you watch a movie, the hero will be going along, and then something bad will happen right before the ending. Like, it's always the worst right before the finale happens.
And it's also filled with self-doubt, uncertainty.
And in this case, the darkest night comes in the dead center of the film.
I thought that was partially some of the camera shots and time constraints. So we don't care about anyone else except for Robert de Bruce.
Yes.
So all of these other figures in the battle, we just don't have time to get to know them. Especially the brothers were a little bit lost in there. I didn't understand.
Yeah, at one point you even asked, I'm sorry, that was his brother?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Because there should have been a line in there that talked about where is your. I don't think that they say that. I don't think they say where is your brother. They say where is Robert de Bruce.
He says, my brothers, and they're all sitting at the table at that one point with his wife. And that's the only time.
Right,
even
but
then, I had to
in
pick
that
up and go
moment,
back on that.
In that moment, it should have been reiterated to remind the audience where we are familially.
I mean, I think it's important to note that this is actually the second cut of the film. There's actually a longer cut of the film that premiered about 2 months ago at the Toronto International Film Festival that had 23 additional minutes in it. And you can actually see a couple bits in the trailer, the first trailer of the film, where they're racing on the beach with horses as one of them. They're coming up with the boats. And they said there's a lot of small moments like that may have gotten cut on the floor, you know. Best example I can think of is the movie Kingdom of Heaven from about 10, 15 years ago now. The theatrical cut and the director's cut are like 30 minutes different. And if you watch the director's cut, it's a slower film, yes, but it feels more epic. And I wonder if Netflix wasn't really willing to go in full on what a historic epic feels like. You know, those great big sweeping shots of the Scottish countryside. It almost felt like they were ashamed to show that at certain points, and they were just so quick. And they go back into the action again in case you might lose people, as opposed to losing them in the history.
I feel like there were a lot of moments where the camera work doesn't really work for the film itself, and it undercuts some of the emotional moments. So the very first sequence in the film is fantastic. It's one long shot, and every single element gives us character information, it gives us plot information, and it ramps up the tension at the same time. It does everything that you want your opening shot to do. And it's maybe 7 or 8 minutes long.
Oh yeah, it's a 7 or 8 minute continuous shot. And it's not just people talking. We go inside, outside, sword fight. There's a trebuchet firing at the end. Real trebuchet, by the way, actually called Warwolf, even in its historic location, that actually was built. And even the small detail of it took them 3 months, and he wouldn't let them surrender until he got to fire it, actually historically true. Because that's the kind of guy where the Longshanks was.
And there are a lot of good scenes in the movie, but that is, for me, the best scene in the movie. And I feel like it's utilizing the camera choice really, really well. But then there are other scenes where it feels like everything has happened almost like it's happening on stage. I felt like it was especially true when he kills Comyn. Am I saying that correctly?
Comyn, John Comyn.
Oh, okay. It's spelled differently than
It's
that.
Comyn. I've been told by our Scottish viewers that it's Comyn.
Okay, thank you.
Instead of Comyn, which is why I said it originally.
Okay, so
Not Scotch Gaelic. Sorry about that, guys.
So at his death, I feel like it happens, and it's all in the it's one continuous shot.
Yeah.
From the middle, and then they switch the camera behind for a moment and then forward again. But it's all from the same level, and we don't see a shot where Robert De Bruce looks at the altar, and then we look at the altar and realize truly that he's on holy ground, and he's done this on holy ground. He just lays the body down and runs out.
Yeah, and they actually lampshade it in the next scene by talking about the fact they have to go to a priest because he's a damned man. And it's kind of hard to describe to modern audiences just how important the fear of excommunication was. And he was excommunicated, though they don't really go into it too deep in the film. But that was a huge to-do. I mean, that means that not only is he damned, but technically anyone in Scotland, if they follow him as a king, also is barred from entry to heaven. Which, I mean, in a period where you're still doing crusades, I mean, that's...
Anyone who has knowledge of Henry VIII, I think, which is a little bit more well-known, will know what a big decision that is for the Scots to take that on. But for me, that scene especially, I didn't realize how full that commitment was until they started talking about it later. I should have realized in the moment the decision he was making and the horror of it. And how he is damning himself. But I didn't, because he didn't seem to recognize it, because the cinematography didn't.
And it's kind of hard when your first scene is just so good, and the rest of your film has to live up to that.
Yeah. That was a very high bar.
Set for the whole movie.
And that's sometimes I think happens with directors, producers, writers. They get really excited about this idea, and it's a good idea. But then so much energy is put into it, and then it's like, well, now what? How do we make the rest of the film
Get through the rest of it. Yeah,
ramp up this way, just to increase attention? And it was a very tense film. I'm not saying that, but but to start out that way, it's almost impossible to keep it.
So we're talking about details in the film, the costuming. I mean, you have a background in costuming, did it for several years. So yeah, what's some of the things that really jumped out at you?
I think that there was a lot of respect for the time period, and having it be beautiful in its own way, and having it be opulent but on its own terms, instead of trying to inflect a modern feel upon it. I felt like they let the cloth and the embroidery and the beauty of the fabrics speak, which was nice.
One of the people we were watching with actually asked, are they wearing dressing gowns, nightgowns?
Nope, that's just how it was.
That's just how it looked. But especially the Bruce's shawl at the beginning, I really liked. You could see the individual hand-stitched embroidery on there. And
At several points that happened.
Just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, no crazy garish colors. I mean, just something that felt very of the period, which is not something you see a whole lot of. Really impressive. But yet still felt like a full, rich, and developed world. You know, nobody felt like they were in leathers or like, you know, being dragged out of a sewer somewhere. As far as historical details go, there's a lot of just really great stuff peppered throughout the film. You asked me at one point during the ceremony of kingship, why is the woman talking right there? Not in like a sexist way, but you're like...
No, I was just intrigued that the person who is crowning Robert De Bruce is a woman, and they highlighted it so clearly that they wanted us to know that bit of Scottish history. So I asked, is it historical?
Yeah, and so there was actually two different ceremonies. There's the first one that's in a church, and then the next day, because a prominent noblewoman couldn't make it, I believe she was of the clan Macduff. Now, if I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. But basically, as part of that clan, she had the right to actually crown the monarchs of the Scots. So they held a second service just so she could do that. And so they included that detail in the film.
Yeah.
They never even explained it, really. It's just there. So for people that love and appreciate it, it's there, and there's so many things like that. James Douglas raiding his own castle by running into a church and screaming Douglas. actually happens.
That's fantastic. It's a fantastic moment. And they set that up really well. One of the only side characters that you care about is that one, because they made him really clear from the opening exactly what he wanted, exactly his role, and how we would follow him. And then they followed through in very satisfying ways.
There's one, though, that you and I both felt the same about, which is when the Queen suddenly is like, I will be with you and choose you forever.
Yeah, not earned. That fealty was not earned. There were some really nice scenes leading up to that.
I felt like we needed one more.
We needed one more, yeah.
Yeah, a little more.
And I think it existed somewhere, but...
I would love to see a director's cut of this film, but, you know, as it's Netflix, who knows if they do that sort of thing. This is really the first ventures into series film that we've seen from them. Their previous efforts have been things like Death Note, which...
Oh, we can't talk about that.
So bad.
Okay.
The opening sword fight is drawing directly from something called the I-33 Tower Fight Book, which is actually in the Tower of London. It's a fighting manual from about the 1350s. And at certain points, they're almost perfectly hitting the poses that are from the book. And it really surprised me how accurate they were. And they're obviously trying to give that feel. But conversely, Chris Pine, for some reason, never felt powerful to me in that film. Like, I never believed him as a guy that would hit somebody with an axe so hard the axe would break.
But we talked about that. He never does. And for me, he never does. That's just not where his power lies, where his appeal lies.
We're actually talking at the beginning of the film, you know, Chris Pine's in Star Trek, and you asked how tall was he? Because he's like the shortest guy in the film. He's 6 foot tall. He's actually a really big guy. But for some reason in these scenes, he never seems physically imposing.
No, I thought he was Tom Cruise sized. I did. I thought they were the same height. I think what his strengths are is that they really wanted to play Robert De Bruce as a man of the people. And that's, so if you have two crowning ceremonies, they could have picked the one in the church. They picked the one that was done outside. They made it outside in front of the people by a representative of the Scots instead of a representative of the church. So they made that choice for a reason. And it was to emphasize that he is the king of the Scots, the people of Scots. And that's what he says.
And Chris Pine actually took a lot of flack for taking this role. I mean, a lot of people are like, I've seen several comments on my own page about how come they didn't hire Scott for this.
Oh, I actually.
And to anyone that's asked this, I'll put it this way. Hell or High Water was the same director and actor combo and did very well, won an Academy Award. This film would not have been made if Chris Pine was not attached to it.
That's true.
You know, Netflix is not willing to invest, probably $60, $70 million. I don't know the exact number. I'm sure it's high, very high.
It looked expensive.
Yeah. Holy whoa, did it look expensive.
You could tell. That's
normally
nice.
You can spot shoddy CG, and I cannot tell where the CG began and the scene ended at a lot of points, where the sets that they built of the castles, of the dirt, backed up to the CG. I mean, it was that good.
And they burned down some things. They burned down a few things, too. That's expensive.
Was that trebuchet real? I don't know. It was big, and it looked like it.
I mean, the fireball was not real.
The fireball wasn't real, but I mean,
did they build a trebuchet?
Spin? I don't know.
They built something.
It'd be a good way to waste $100,000. It'd be fun.
It'd be a really good way.
There's a lot of rumors about a sequel. As I said, this is really just the first part of the story of Robert the Bruce. From this, he goes on to his greatest victory and really unites all of Scotland and officially kicks out the English.
And having a layperson's knowledge of this time period, I'm intrigued. I want to know, as a viewer, what happens next. And I don't want to look it up on Wikipedia. I really want them to do it for me.
But I mean, there's an epilogue at the end of the film. I mean, they have just words up on the screen. It feels like they're not going to make a sequel almost. Like they went.
But they didn't tell us what happens to Robert De Bruce. They intentionally skip it.
The Queen originally was returned after the Battle of Bannockburn, which I guess would be after the second film. But I guess if you're going to make a second film, she was such a strong character in this and so delightful to watch that you can't have her in a cage for an entire movie. No.
Well, she wouldn't have been in one for that entire length of time, or she definitely would have died.
She was.
She was in a cage.
They kept her in a cage from 1307
hanging outside
until 1310.
Hanging
two
outside.
years hanging outside, yeah. Kid you not. Edward I had it specifically built just to hold her. It's actually the second guy, the younger guy, that actually released her and let her live indoors. Now, a lot of people are like, there's no way they would have made somebody live outside like that. Now, I personally think they probably held her out there in the day and then moved her in at night when nobody was looking because, that's the point is to...
Right. Have her stay alive. Yeah.
I recommend the film to people. I mean, if you're a fan of medieval history, despite our grumblings right here, it's fun. It's a good little film. To set it, though, Edward II was not at the Battle of Loudon Hill at all. He wasn't even there. He was still in the south. He actually went north right after the battle. disbanded the army and just came back down again. Now, Ever the First did die en route, though, on the way, which is sort of fun. Nice little detail. But, yeah. Even his last words, boil me and carry me into battle against the Scots, are theoretically true. I was a man who really hated the Scots. Great job from that actor. Obviously, we normally play Stannis Baratheon on Game of Thrones. And it's funny, after having seen that, I didn't think of him as Stannis at any point in that. Cause
And that's another good example of the strengths of the costuming. His hair, his makeup, everything was right on point. And especially when people die in this film, they do a really good job with the makeup.
They're saying this might be the rebirth of the historic epic.
No, I think that there is still room for historical epics to come back as film. What we've been seeing, though, is a lot of
TV series
that fall into that same wheelhouse, and so that's why they decided to make, I think, because Netflix has had a lot of success with historical pieces.
Yeah.
And so they stuck their toe in the water on bringing back the historical epic by making a fairly safe choice, which was to ride on the back of the historical epic for a lot of people, especially 30 or older. Braveheart is the touchstone for that.
I've been criticized for saying it's not a sequel to Braveheart. Yes, I'm clear it's not a sequel to Braveheart, but for the
producers,
people, it really is. They were thinking about it the entire time. In fact, I'm going to reveal this to you right now because I didn't tell you this. They filmed the scene where Robert the Bruce met William Wallace in the Forest of Selkirk and then cut it.
Oh yeah, they definitely should have cut it.
Why?
Because they didn't need it, and it would be just really jarring for the audience because we would be saying it's not Mel Gibson. Does everybody know it's not Mel Gibson?
And that's exactly what they said.
Yeah.
They said that it's like, just have him a name whispered in the wind and sort of move on with it.
And clearly we're grappling with it. And then there's lines about he's an idea, not a man, which is very relevant. And if you have a man show up after you say he's an idea, not a man, then you're kind of undercutting your own thesis.
And that's pretty much the high points of the film. I mean, if you want to go through the history of it, feel free to take a look at my other video. I mean, like I said, it's basically paint by numbers for at least half of the film. And then at the end, sort of bit of a right-hand turn, but even then, it's just including a character that wasn't there at Loudon Hill that really sort of throws everything off. But as I said, just super damn impressive how they managed to weave everything in. That's a art in and of itself to take these seemingly just random bits of history and string them back together into a story again. But I enjoyed it.
I did. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would, actually, because this is not really my genre. I'm like, oh, they're whipping out the swords now. I'll just fall asleep. Sorry for that. But it actually held my attention a lot better than I thought it would. It had a lot of what I like in film and miss in film, which is the really good line, which I feel like has been missing as of late. I like me a good line, and there are several in here.
Yeah.
So.
And good performances, and that's what people forget is the historic epic is more than just swords bashing together. You got to have an underlying character, you got to have an underlying narrative and a love of the world to go with it. And I definitely think that the people that made this clearly loved what they were doing and wanted to try and create something that felt.
There's a lot of passion here, and I feel like any audience will respond to a passionate work.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little write-up. And if you have questions about the film or things that you picked up on and were wondering about, hey, leave them at the bottom. I'd be glad to talk to you about it.
Because there's a lot, it's worth talking about. There's a lot here. There's a lot to be said. And there might not be as many venues for talking about the historical epic as other genres.
Yeah. But yeah, as long as we're talking about it, people will keep making it. So, hey, leave your comments below. And thanks for watching.